Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who would pack her entire life into 3 suitcases at the age of 72. But here I am, standing in my empty kitchen, keys in hand, about to walk away from 47 years of marriage for good. The morning light streams through the window where I used to stand washing dishes for decades, watching the seasons change while my husband sat in his recliner, remote control in one hand, complaints ready on his lips. For so many years, I believed this was simply what marriage looked like after the honeymoon phase faded. I convinced myself that his constant criticism was just his way of showing he cared, that his dismissal of my thoughts and feelings was normal for men of his generation. It started small, as these things always do. In our early years together, he would make little comments about my cooking, suggesting his mother had done it better. When I tried a new recipe, he would take one bite and push the plate away, saying he preferred simple food. I learned to cook only what he liked. When I wanted to take evening classes at the community college, he reminded me that we needed to save money and that I had never been much of a student anyway. I put away the enrollment forms. Over the decades, I watched my world shrink inch by inch. Friends stopped calling because he would complain about them staying too long or talking too loud. I stopped inviting them over. When I suggested we take a vacation somewhere I had always wanted to go, he would list all the reasons why it was impractical, expensive, or unnecessary. We took his preferred fishing trips instead, where I would sit by the lake reading while he ignored me for hours. The pattern became so familiar that I stopped recognizing it as a pattern at all. Every opinion I expressed was met with his superior knowledge. Every interest I developed was quietly discouraged, until I abandoned it. Every small joy I found was diminished by his indifference or outright mockery. I told myself this was compromise. This was how marriages worked. Some women have husbands who beat them, I reasoned. At least he never laid a hand on me. But there are different kinds of violence, I learned too late. There is the violence of being made to feel invisible in your own home. There is the cruelty of having your thoughts dismissed before you finish speaking them. There is the particular pain of being married to someone who treats you like an inconvenient roommate rather than a life partner. The breaking point came on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Our daughter had just called to tell us she was pregnant with our first grandchild. I hung up the phone with tears of joy in my eyes, rushing to share the news with him. He was in his usual spot, watching some sports program I had never learned to care about. I sat down beside him, barely able to contain my excitement. "She's having a baby," I told him. "We're going to be grandparents." I waited for his face to light up the way mine had, for him to reach for my hand, for some sign that this moment meant as much to him as it did to me. He glanced at me briefly, then turned back to the television. "Well, I hope she's thought this through," he said. "Kids are expensive. She barely makes enough to support herself." He reached for his beer and took a long drink. "Besides, I'm too old to be chasing around some screaming kid at family gatherings." I felt something inside me break that night. Not crack or bend, but actually shatter. I sat there looking at this man I had spent nearly 5 decades with, and I realized that I had been living with a stranger. Worse than a stranger. Strangers at least had the potential to surprise you with kindness. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I called my sister and asked if I could come stay with her for a few days. I told her I needed some time to think. She did not ask questions, just told me to come right over. During those 3 days away, I walked through her quiet house and remembered what it felt like to have opinions that mattered. She asked what I wanted for dinner, what I wanted to watch on television, if I wanted to go to the garden center or the bookstore. Small questions, but they reminded me that I was a person with preferences, with desires, with thoughts worth considering. When I returned home, I saw everything with new eyes. I noticed how he never asked about my day but expected me to listen to every detail of his. I observed how he interrupted me mid-sentence but became irritated if anyone did the same to him. I watched how he dismissed my concerns about my arthritis while expecting immediate attention for his slightest aches and pains. I began to keep a journal, writing down these observations, not out of spite, but because I needed to see the patterns clearly. I had spent so many years making excuses for his behavior that I had lost track of what was actually happening in my own marriage. Meanwhile, our daughter's pregnancy progressed, and with each phone call, his negativity became more pronounced. When she told us she was having a girl, he complained that girls were more expensive to raise. When she shared her chosen names, he criticized them all. When she sent ultrasound pictures, he barely glanced at them. I found myself making excuses to her for his reactions, the way I had been making excuses to myself for decades. But the words felt hollow now. I was tired of apologizing for someone else's inability to find joy in anything. The final straw came when our granddaughter was born. I wanted to drive to the hospital immediately, to hold this new little person and help our daughter in those first overwhelming days. He refused to go, claiming hospitals were full of germs and that new parents needed space. When I suggested I could drive myself, he reminded me that I was not comfortable with highway driving and that I would probably get lost. I looked at this man who had spent decades undermining my confidence, who had convinced me I was incapable of managing things I had managed perfectly well before I married him. In that moment, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to the hospital alone. The 2-hour drive on highways I supposedly could not navigate past without incident. I arrived safely, held my granddaughter for the first time, and spent the afternoon helping my daughter with practical things like breastfeeding positions and diaper changes. For the first time in years, I felt useful, needed, appreciated. When I returned home that evening, he was waiting for me with a lecture about how worried he had been, how irresponsible I had been to drive alone, how I could have called him if I had gotten into trouble. But his words bounced off me like rain on a windshield. I had driven those highways just fine. I had been helpful and competent. I had remembered who I used to be before I became so small. That night, I made another decision. I called a lawyer. The conversation was harder than I had expected. After 47 years of marriage, the legal and financial complications seemed overwhelming. But the lawyer, a kind woman about my daughter's age, walked me through everything patiently. She did not ask why I was leaving. She did not suggest counseling or reconciliation. She simply helped me understand my options. I spent the next month quietly preparing. I opened my own bank account for the first time in decades. I researched apartments in the same town as my daughter. I began sorting through possessions, deciding what was truly mine and what I could live without. He noticed none of these preparations. I had become so invisible to him over the years that my increased activities did not register. He continued his routine of complaints and dismissals, unaware that I was no longer absorbing them the way I once had. The day I told him I was leaving was unseasonably warm for October. I had chosen the timing carefully, after he had finished his breakfast but before his first beer of the day. I sat across from him at the kitchen table where we had eaten thousands of meals together and said the words I had been rehearsing for weeks. I am leaving you. I am filing for divorce. I will be moved out by the end of the month. His reaction was everything I had expected, and somehow still shocking. He laughed at first, as if I had told him a joke. When he realized I was serious, he became angry, listing all the ways I would fail on my own. I was too old, too set in my ways, too dependent. I would be back within a month, begging him to take me back. When anger did not work, he tried bargaining. He would change, he promised. He would be more appreciative, more involved. We could take that vacation I had always wanted. We could go to counseling together. Finally came the tears and the self-pity. How could I do this to him? How could I abandon him in his old age? What would people think? What would our daughter think? I listened to all of it with a calmness that surprised me. These were not new arguments. They were the same tools he had always used to control me, to make me doubt myself, to keep me small and manageable. The difference was that they no longer worked. Our daughter's reaction was not what I had feared. When I called to tell her about the divorce, there was a long silence. Then she said something that nearly broke my heart. I have been wondering for years why you stayed with him. I thought maybe you were happy in some way I did not understand." She had been watching, I realized. She had seen her father's treatment of me and had been waiting for me to see it too. The relief in her voice when I told her about my new apartment, my plans for the future, was unmistakable. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. During that time, I lived in a small apartment with a view of the mountains I had always loved but had rarely been allowed to visit. I furnished it slowly, choosing each piece carefully. I bought a bright red couch simply because I loved the color. I hung paintings on the walls that made me smile. I filled the windowsills with plants that I watered and tended without anyone telling me I was wasting time or money. I began to remember who I had been before I became half of a couple. I remembered that I had once enjoyed cooking elaborate meals just for the pleasure of trying new flavors. I remembered that I had been good at making friends, that people had once sought out my company and my advice. I remembered that I had dreams and ambitions that had nothing to do with anyone else's comfort or convenience. The first time I went to dinner alone at a restaurant was terrifying. I was certain everyone was staring at me, pitying the old woman eating by herself. But as the evening progressed, I realized that no one was paying any attention to me at all. I was free to eat slowly, to read a book between courses, to order dessert or not as I pleased. It was liberating in a way I had not expected. I began taking the community college classes I had given up decades earlier. Art history, creative writing, basic computer skills. My classmates were mostly younger, but they welcomed me warmly. I discovered I had strong opinions about Renaissance painting and a talent for descriptive writing that I had never known existed. Later that first winter, I started volunteering at the hospital where my granddaughter had been born. The staff there appreciated my reliability and my calm presence with nervous new parents. I found myself giving advice to young mothers who reminded me of my daughter, sharing the wisdom I had accumulated over 7 decades of living. My granddaughter began walking just after her first birthday, and I was there to witness her first wobbly steps. I babysat her regularly, singing songs I had not sung in years, reading books that sparked my own imagination as much as hers. Being with her reminded me that life is meant to be full of wonder and discovery, that curiosity and joy are not luxuries but necessities. Meanwhile, my former husband struggled with his new reality. He had to learn to cook for himself, to manage household tasks he had never touched, to fill the long hours he had once spent criticizing me. According to mutual friends, he was bitter and angry, telling anyone who would listen about my selfishness and ingratitude. I felt sorry for him, in a distant way. He was a man who had never learned to find happiness within himself, who had used my diminishment to feel powerful and important. Without someone to control and criticize, he was lost. But his struggles were no longer my responsibility to fix. The second year of my new life brought unexpected changes. I met another volunteer at the hospital, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. He was kind and gentle, interested in my thoughts and opinions. When we went for coffee after our shifts, he asked about my day and actually listened to my answers. When I mentioned a book I was reading, he went to the library to find a copy so we could discuss it together. I was not looking for romance at 74, but friendship grew naturally between us. He made me laugh in ways I had forgotten were possible. He encouraged my interests and celebrated my small victories. When I told him I was thinking about taking a watercolor painting class, he immediately wanted to know when it started and whether I would share my paintings with him. The contrast with my former marriage was stark and sometimes painful. I grieved for all the years I had spent with someone who had never shown genuine interest in who I was as a person. But I also felt grateful for this unexpected second chance at companionship. Now, 3 years after I walked away from that empty kitchen, I wake up each morning in my bright apartment and feel something I had not felt in decades: anticipation for the day ahead. I have plans and projects and people who value my company. I have discovered that I am funnier than I thought, more creative than I imagined, stronger than I ever believed possible. My granddaughter, now a chattering 3-year-old, visits me regularly. She helps me water my plants and sits beside me while I paint watercolor landscapes. She calls my apartment the happy house, and I suppose she is right. It is happy, in the quiet way of a life finally lived on one's own terms. Sometimes I think about all the years I lost, all the dreams I deferred, all the parts of myself I allowed to wither away. But regret is a luxury I cannot afford now. I am 75 years old, and if I am lucky, I have perhaps 15 or 20 years left. I intend to make them count. Last month, I did something I never thought I would have the courage to do. I booked a trip to Italy, something I had dreamed about for 40 years but had never been allowed to pursue. I will go alone, and I will see the art and architecture and countryside that have fascinated me for so long. I will eat gelato for breakfast if I want to, and stay out past midnight if the mood strikes me. The woman I used to be would have been terrified by such a plan. She would have found a dozen reasons why it was impractical or inappropriate. But I am no longer that woman. I am someone who has learned that it is never too late to start living the life you actually want, rather than the life you think you should have. When people ask me if I am happy, I tell them that happiness is not quite the right word. I am content and peaceful and occasionally delighted by small everyday miracles. I am free to be myself without apology or explanation. I am old enough to know that such freedom is rare and precious, and young enough in spirit to make the most of it. Standing in my kitchen this morning, watering the herbs I grow on my windowsill, I caught my reflection in the glass. The woman looking back at me has silver hair and laugh lines and hands spotted with age. But her eyes are bright with possibilities, and her smile is entirely her own. She is someone I am proud to have become, someone I wish I had met decades sooner. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps we become who we are meant to be not in spite of our struggles but because of them. Perhaps it takes a lifetime of losing ourselves to finally understand what it means to be found.